Hey book lovers, I'm Elise and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about some of my favorite bookish buzzwords and some book recommendations to go along with those. So these are words that if they're anywhere in the title of a book or in the summary of a book, it automatically makes me want to read it. So my first buzzword is time travel. So this can be time travel. It could also be multiverse or parallel universe. The first book recommendation for the time travel buzzword is The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I am due for a reread, but I have read it a couple times already. It's very enchanting. The whole concept of time travel within this book, I think, is very unique. It follows Henry and Claire, and Henry has this genetic disorder that basically forces him to time travel to various impactful moments of his life spontaneously. So he has no control over it. He has no idea when it's going to happen. He has no idea when he will time travel back to his present day. The really interesting part about this and the love story between Claire and Henry is that the first time that Claire meets Henry, she's like 6 years old and Henry's in his 40s. But for Henry, because he time traveled back to her, obviously in the present day, he's already known Claire and been married to her for years. Yet the first time that Henry meets Claire in his timeline, they're like college age, so late teens, early 20s. So when Claire finds him, she's known him for years, but he hasn't met her yet in his own timeline. I know that sounds really strange and a little sketchy, but it's really not. This whole novel blew me away. I love the writing style. It's very mind-bending. I highly recommend it. I really, really want to read this again. I want to just stop filming and go read it. The next book recommendation for the time travel buzzword, I just recently read. It was actually my first 5-star read of 2023, and that is The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This book spans from the years 1912 to the year 2401. The concept of time travel for this one is in the future. There's actually a dedicated body of government or bureau of some sort that dedicates themselves to the management of timelines. The next book recommendation for the time travel buzzword is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is the first science fiction novel that was ever written by a Black woman. It focuses on Dana, who is African American, and she lives in California in the 1970s with her white husband. She ends up traveling back in time outside of her control to Antebellum, Maryland on a slave-owning plantation. And over the course of the book, she does time travel multiple times back to this exact time and location, and she does end up becoming a very important, impactful person to this family. The next recommendation for the time travel buzzword is Una Out of Order by Margarita Montemor. This one I have not read yet, but it sounds super intriguing. Again, this is another one where the character who is doing the time traveling has no control over it. On New Year's Eve, 1982, Una is about to turn 19 years old, but when she does, she wakes up in her 51-year-old body 32 years later. And from that moment on, each New Year's Eve at the stroke of midnight, which is also her birthday, she wakes up at a different point in her own timeline. The next recommendation for the time travel buzzword is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Now, this one is not specifically time travel. This one has more to do with parallel universes, multiverses. This is a story about a man who is abducted and knocked unconscious. When he awakes, he is himself, but not in the life that he knows. In the life that he knows, he has a wife, he has a kid, he's a physics professor, but in this life, he doesn't have the family. He has the life that he would have had if he would have followed his dreams in physics. The next recommendation for the time travel buzzword is The Paradox Hotel by Rob Hart. This one I have not read yet, but it takes place in a world where there is a hotel that the ultra-rich go and catch flights to different points throughout history. And the last recommendation for the time travel buzzword is In a Holidays by Christina Lauren. This one I have also read. I absolutely loved it. This one is kind of time travel, but it's more of like a Groundhog Day, repeating the same day over and over type theme. This one follows Maylin, who's on a trip to Utah with her family and some close family friends. While there, she gets into an accident, and when she wakes up, she's back on the plane heading to Utah. And every morning after that, she wakes back up on the plane heading to Utah. So every day she's waking up and forced to repeat the same day over and over again until she can figure out why it's happening and how she can stop it. Our next buzzword is Gothic. So this refers to a literary aesthetic, which refers to elements such as being set in a castle, having a gloomy horror type atmosphere. A lot of times there's some supernatural elements, women in distress, overwrought emotions, and an overall sense of mystery and suspense. The first recommendation for the Gothic buzzword is Anatomy of Love Story by Dana Schwartz. This one is set in the 1800s in Edinburgh, Scotland, and follows Hazel Sinnott, who more than anything else wants to be a surgeon. During a time in history where women just were not prevalent in the medical field aside from maybe being a nurse. For this one, it is definitely the gloomy, horrific atmosphere, the grave digging, pulling up bodies to use for scientific purposes. Overall, this is a super gothic tale. My next recommendation for the gothic buzzword is Dracula's Child by J.S. Barnes. Now, if you're a fan of Dracula, then I highly suggest you read this one. This book cunningly uses the same type of writing style and verbiage as the work by Bram Stoker, and it picks up years later after Jonathan and Mina Harker have vanquished Count Dracula. Now they have a son called Quincy. Everyone's back in England, but there is a new evil afoot, and Jonathan and Mina struggle with how to raise a child in this new world while still trying to recover from the trauma they experienced back in Transylvania. My next recommendation is Angelica Frankenstein Makes Her Match by Sally Thorne. This is a historical romance, and it focuses on siblings Angelica and Victor Frankenstein, both of which are working on a project to reanimate the dead using various pieces of recently deceased individuals. And for Angelica, in this day and age, she's kind of to the point where people feel sorry for her because she's not yet married, so her project leads her to create, in her mind's eye, the perfect man. This is their love story. My next recommendation is The Witches of New York by Amy McKay. This is another novel set in the 1800s. Pretty common time for Gothic literature. It follows some witches in New York who own a shop where people from all walks of life come in for their assistance, usually in the form of cures, tinctures, potions, palm readings, you name it. My next recommendation for the Gothic buzzword is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Now, I read this a couple years ago. I didn't rate it super highly, but thinking back, I do remember the atmosphere, and the atmosphere was impeccable. I definitely want to give this a reread. What it's about is Noemi is a debutante. She is a girly girl. She likes partying. She gets a letter from her cousin who is recently married and basically begging her to come rescue her from her new home in the Mexican countryside. So Noemi gets to this house, and the longer that Noemi is there, she starts to feel things are just not right. Something is going on and nobody is telling her what it is, and so far her cousin is either unwilling or incapable of explaining things. So for now, Noemi is staying there with her cousin, trying to convince her to leave with her, and things get a little hairy. And very similar vibe to Mexican Gothic, my next recommendation is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This one I absolutely loved. It's a novella, it's not super long. Very similar vibes, very similar atmosphere. Think dark and dreary and gloomy and wet. Everything is wet. This book follows Alex Easton, who is a retired soldier, and they receive a letter from their childhood friend, Madeline Usher, who says that she is dying and requests their presence. Alex makes their way to Madeline's home in the countryside to offer aid, condolences, anything that they can. Now, this home is set beside a lake, and there's an overgrowth of fungus, and there's possessed rabbits, and it's an interesting time. My next buzzword is haunted houses. The book that probably first got me into haunted house stories is, of course, Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This was my first Riley Sager read. It was 5 stars. Absolutely loved it. There is a song in this book. It's a song from a musical, so chances are you probably know what it is. I cannot listen to that song now without getting chills. Like, I'm thinking about it right now and I have goosebumps. That's how chilling this book is. So this book follows Maggie, who when she was younger, her family bought this estate in Vermont, and one night something happens that forces her family to leave and never return. Since then, her father wrote a book about their experience. Her father ends up dying, and she learns that she has inherited this estate. So she goes back for the first time since having left there when she was young, so that she can clean it up, restore it, get it prepared to sell, and she starts to experience some things. I've read a few more haunted house stories. To this day, this one continues to be my favorite. My next recommendation for the haunted house buzzword is The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. This isn't a haunted house, but it is a haunted motel. In the 80s in upstate New York, a woman goes to work at this motel. A lot of crazy stuff happens. She ends up disappearing. Just poof. Disappears. Present day, her niece comes upon working at this exact same motel. She follows some clues, and she's basically trying to investigate and figure out what happened to the people at this motel, what happened to her aunt, and a lot of secrets are uncovered. My next recommendation for the haunted house buzzword is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I've not yet read this. I've heard a lot of people talk about the show that came out fairly recently and complaining that the show isn't really similar to the book at all. I haven't seen the show. I don't know much about it, but I think people forgot about the movie, The Haunting, with Liam Neeson, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Owen Wilson. That, again, I've not read this, but based off the summary, that movie sounds pretty close to this. So if you haven't seen that movie, check it out. It's definitely a favorite of mine. So The Haunting of Hill House is about 4 people led by Dr. Montague. He is an occult scholar, basically trying to research the happenings of hauntings. They go to this manor called Hill House that is supposedly really haunted. And at first, things definitely seem spooky, weird phenomenon going on, but the longer they stay there, the crazier things get. The more I'm thinking about it, a lot of these haunted house recommendations also qualify for Gothic, so apparently those go hand in hand. The next recommendation for the haunted house buzzword is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. I've not yet read this one, but it's been said to be Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca. It's supernatural suspense, and it's set in a remote house in Mexico with a sinister haunting. And my last recommendation for the haunted house buzzword is The Invited by Rachel McMahon. This one, have not read this, sounds amazing. Honestly, cannot believe I've not read it yet, but it's about a married couple who move to a rural area and obtain 42 acres of land so that they can build their dream house. While they're building the house, they find materials around the land that they've purchased, and they start kind of incorporating that into the building of the home. So basically, the framework for the house is built using bricks from the mill, items from the farmhouse, beams from the old schoolroom. And unfortunately, it turns out that this property has a really dark past. So as the house is coming together using these materials from the past, it turns the house into a haunted house. Okay, my final buzzword is science. More specifically, if it has to do with either genetics or epidemiologies. So that would include things like genetic engineering and the study of plagues, pandemics, things like that. My first recommendation for the science buzzword is The One by John Mars. This was my first ever John Mars read, and I loved it. 5 stars. This is set in a world where a woman discovers this genetic code in people's DNA. What it does is it provides a bit of a cheat for soulmates to find each other. So similar to DNA ancestry type testing, people can send in their sample, a swab, spit, things like that. If their genetic match has also sent in their sample, then their database would connect these 2 individuals, like, genetically speaking, this is your other half. This is the person that you should be with. Naturally, that causes some issues, because what if you're already married? What if your match has already passed away? What if your match doesn't provide their sample and you never know? So it's a very interesting concept. It was a very fascinating read. True to form to John Mars, it was jaw-dropping and blew my mind. My next recommendation for the science buzzword is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This one I read long time ago. I'm pretty sure I read it in high school, and I'm gonna be 33 in March, so that tells you how long ago I read this. But I remember loving it, and this is the exact copy that I read in high school. Definitely need to reread this. I don't remember the full story, but I remember how it made me feel and how it blew my mind. Let me just read the summary for you. Brave New World is a darkly satiric vision of a utopian future where humans are genetically bred and pharmaceutically anesthetized to passively serve a ruling order. A powerful work of speculative fiction that has enthralled and terrified readers for generations, it remains remarkably relevant to this day as both a warning to be heeded as we head into tomorrow and as thought-provoking, satisfying entertainment. If I remember correctly, this is obviously set in a futuristic dystopian setting, and people have been genetically modified to be the perfect person. So there's no more war. There's no more arguments and disagreements. Everybody has been psychologically manipulated or conditioned to be who they're supposed to be. It kind of gives me The Giver vibes, which is another book that I should really reread. I apologize, I can't really explain too much of this, but highly recommend if you've not yet read it. My next book recommendation for the science buzzword probably doesn't need too much explanation, but Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Right, and I can't remember which way. There's a certain way to hold this so that you can see. Okay, can you kind of see that? In case you've been living under a rock, this is about scientists manipulating DNA that they find in fossils, in the rocks, in fossilized amber, things like that, and they genetically engineer dinosaurs back into existence. My next book recommendation for the science buzzword is The End of October by Lawrence Wright. I haven't read this one yet, but based off the summary, this is going to be for fans of the movies Outbreak, Contagion. It follows a scientist who is trying to study this viral outbreak that is just wiping people off the face of the planet. I get really giddy about stuff like this. That's like, okay, you want to know how messed up I am? When, what do people call it? The panini, the panorama, when that became a thing, people were forced into lockdown. We had to stay home, work from home. You know what I did? Yeah, I immediately had a marathon. I watched Outbreak and then I watched Contagion and I'm like, this is fascinating. What is wrong with me? I think that's just how I deal with things. I'm a very scientific minded, analytically thinking individual. I'm an Enneagram type 5, INTP. That's just how my brain works. When I'm trying to deal with things, I don't do so emotionally. I do so using facts and science. Everyone copes in their own way. And for me, dealing with a panini meant watching my comfort movies that have to do with viral outbreaks. And my final book recommendation for my final buzzword is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This one is also about a virus that breaks out and spreads across the world at an astonishing rate and basically wipes out the majority of the population. And it focuses on kind of present day when this is kind of first coming to light and people are starting to get sick and very, very, very rapidly passing from the virus. But then it also does have a post-apocalyptic focus in the future with the population of people that did manage to survive. Okay, those are all my recommendations for my buzzwords. Let me know down in the comments below what some of your buzzwords are, and then please let me know if you have any other suggestions for any of mine. And as a recap, my buzzwords are time travel, parallel universe, multiverse, gothic literature, haunted houses, and science, specifically DNA, genetic engineering, and epidemiology. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I appreciate you guys being here. Please be sure to like and subscribe as that really helps out my channel. And until next time, bye!